Good morning, once again. So we've been going through this series of lessons on following Jesus, on discipleship, and we have been following Matthew's pattern as he has walked us through this concept and this idea of what true discipleship looks like. And so this morning, as we begin this lesson, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think about this question and kind of mull it around in your mind. And it may not take you very long to answer this question. Some of you may have to think a little bit, but I want to ask this question to kind of get our minds focused on what we're going to study this morning. And the question is, what is your greatest fear? What is your greatest fear? So as you are thinking about that and you're thinking about your greatest fear, things that you might wake up in the morning and you think about, things that you might fear as you talk to people, you kind of fear this thing, or maybe when you see it on TV, it just really stirs within you a sense of kind of uncomfortable feeling. I want to say dread or terror, but maybe not that extreme, but maybe the idea of just something that you're just very uncomfortable with and you fear the outcome. What is your greatest fear? And so as I was preparing for this lesson, I do what you always do when you talk about fear. I Googled the 10 top fears in America. What are the 10 top fears? And of course, there's a whole bunch of lists that come up. And the one that comes up most frequently is the one that talks about public speaking at the top. You ever see that one? Everybody's scared of that. I mean, nobody wants to get up here and talk in public. The idea of heights, people are very afraid of heights. I can attest to that. I don't really care much for heights. It's not really the heights part, it's really the falling part that bothers me the most. But the idea of heights, going to the dentist. Everybody's afraid of going to the dentist, right? And I really fear the bill these days coming in the mail more than the dentist itself. I mean, I'll take the pain, but the pain of having to pay that out, it's really hard. The snakes and spiders, mice, dogs. You know, out of all these lists, nobody mentioned cats. Or we might have to rethink that one. I don't know. Cats are pretty intimidating. And so cats, flying. People are afraid of flying. People are afraid of enclosed spaces. And I think that's pretty natural to be afraid of enclosed spaces. But one that was really interesting to me was open spaces. You know, if you are living in Monahans, Texas, and you're afraid of open spaces, I'm sorry. I'm just going to apologize right there, because we have a lot of that. People are afraid of thunder and lightning. People are afraid of that. But there's some other things I found that were really interesting. People fear uncertainty. We just really fear that, don't we? We're very fearful of things that we're uncertain about. We fear failure. We fear rejection. I think we all fear a bit of that. We feel like maybe we're not doing enough, or we're not being enough, and we're not accomplishing enough. I think that's the preacher's greatest fear of every congregation I've ever been to or talked to. I mean, that seems to be the fear of every preacher, every public speaker. The fear of missing out. The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. I think that's what they were talking about, that there's always something. There's a lack of contentment, and we fear that there's something just over the horizon that's just better than our situation. We have kind of a fear of complacency, really, is what that is. A fear of change and a fear of losing control. We really want to have control of things, and we really fear that. And more recently, that list has kind of changed. I mean, those are pretty common things that you would expect to find year in and year out. But more recently, that list has changed, and people are really fearful of our political climate right now, especially in America. People are really fearful of that. They wake up in the morning, and that's what they think about. They go to bed at night, and that's what they're concerned about. What will November bring? What's going to happen with our political climate? Our financial security is tied closely to that, and we're very fearful of that, especially when you enter into retirement and you think, is what I saved up all my life, is that going to work? I mean, is my investments, are they going to be there? We're very fearful of our financial security. Civil unrest hits that list pretty high with a lot of people. People are very fearful of the civil unrest, the tensions in many cities. Thankfully, we don't have that so much here in Monahans, but big cities do suffer from that. Rioting and looting, and people are fearful of those kinds of things. But especially the virus. I think everybody seems to be at least a little bit concerned, if not very fearful, of the virus that has really taken a toll on this year. And so we're fearful of those things. And there's no doubt that there's a lot of things, right? I mean, if you just sit there and make a list of things that we can be fearful from, we're all going to become phobics, We're all going to be terrified of everything. There's so many things in this world that we can be fearful of. And there's no doubt that, if we're going to talk together, there's probably things that I'm fearful of that you're not, and you're fearful of that I'm not, I was having a discussion with somebody one time, this is before I started preaching about leading a prayer, and I was very, very, very fearful of public speaking. And so I was talking to this preacher one time, and he said, I said, well, I'm just not ready to get up there and do that just yet. And the thing that he said was kind of interesting. He said, well, it is intimidating to lead the Lord's people in a prayer to our holy God. And I thought, thanks for that. I was already scared as it was, but now I'm terrified, and that didn't help much. But the idea is that people fear different things. And when we think about fear, and we're considering fear as we're going through this lesson this morning, we're going to be talking in Matthew chapter 8. And we're going to be continuing this story, this narrative that Matthew has built up. And we're going to consider fear in relationship to discipleship. How does that go together? Does it go together? And where are we with this concept? And I think that you've all heard, and you've probably seen it, Facebook, or heard it on TV, and people use the phrase frequently, and I'm sure there will be lots of shirts coming out and hats and stuff that say faith over fear. You've heard that before, haven't you? Faith over fear. And I don't know what people mean when they say that. You never know what people mean when they say phrases like that. What does that actually mean to you and to me? When I say that, when you say that, what does it actually mean? And I assume, at least in my mind, when I hear people say that kind of stuff or say that thing, I assume that people are saying that if you have enough faith, that you shouldn't be afraid. That's what I assume that people are saying. That if you have enough faith, that you shouldn't be afraid. Maybe that's not what they mean, but when I read that, that's what I see. That's what I see. But folks, I want you to listen to me right now. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. As the body of Christ, as the church, we need to be extraordinarily careful not to judge our brothers and our sisters based on their level of fear. Let me say that again. We need to be extremely careful not to judge our brothers and our sisters' faith based on their level of fear. We need to be careful with that. Because let's face it, right? We all know that a lack of fear can simply be ignorance, right? We know that. We understand that. The human condition, the mind, is an amazing thing, and things make us scared based on ignorance. If I'm walking through a field at night and I'm not thinking about anything, and I'm just kind of walking along, and I'm not realizing that I've just passed, several rattlesnakes, it just doesn't bother me, I'm not going to be fearful because I'm ignorant, right? I don't know. What I don't know, I don't fear. Sometimes it's the other way around, but sometimes it's this way, right? Sometimes when we just don't know the danger is there, we don't fear it. It's not a lack of faith. It's just ignorance. And so sometimes that's the case. Sometimes our fear or lack thereof is based on ignorance. Ignorance can be a false sense of security. But with that said, with that understood, knowledge, commitment, and conviction. Knowledge, commitment, and conviction, especially when it comes to our understanding, our relationship to God and to Jesus, should result, right? Should result in courage and confidence. That should be the end result. When we come to understand who Jesus is, who God is, and when we come to understand our relationship to the Father and the Son and the Spirit, that in itself, that information should build within us a level of courage and confidence in this life. So here's where I want us to be for this lesson. This is where I want us to be. Disciples of Jesus are not fearless, but we fear less in light of Jesus' power, authority, and presence. So turn with me to Matthew chapter 8, if you will. Matthew chapter 8 is where we're going to be picking up from last week. We've been looking at these different events taking place in this chapter of Matthew. Remember, this is directly after the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has come down from teaching that great sermon, and here he is. He's preaching to all the people of Israel. And so in Matthew chapter 8, we'll pick up where we left off. Jesus has shown his authority, right? He has shown his authority over sickness. He goes in and he heals this leper by touching him, and we talked about the significance of Jesus actually physically touching this man. He heals the centurion's servant from a distance, so we know that Jesus has that power, doesn't he? He could just say it and the person is healed. He doesn't have to physically touch somebody. Jesus has that kind of authority. And then in verse 14, we see that Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law and heals her as he comes into the home. Now look in verse 16. Verse 16 says that when evening came, they brought him many who were demon-possessed. And he cast out the spirits with the word and healed all who were ill. So Jesus not only has power over sickness, but he has power over the demons, the dark forces, the evil influences that are in the world. Jesus has authority over those. They have to obey him. They obey his word. They obey his command. Jesus has authority over those things. In verse 17, this was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. He himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. And so last week, we stopped around the scribe. We looked at the scribe who comes to Jesus, and he makes this bold proclamation. Remember what that was? He said, "I will follow you wherever you go." And we talked about the meaning of that and the significance of that in our own life and how we need to be willing to say things like this. But we also need to be willing to heed the warning that Jesus gives about discipleship, saying that discipleship comes with a cost. It comes with a cost. That following Jesus, that being his disciple, needs to take precedence over everything else in our life. Because there will be other things that are going to come up because we are disciples of Jesus. They're going to try to snatch us away from him, right? That there will be things in this world that are not going to be favorable to us, that once may have been easy, right? I mean, that may have been a simple thing. Life may have been easy for these people until they became disciples of Jesus. And suddenly things got really hard. And for some, they would fall away and they would leave Jesus because it becomes too hard. And so we need to be forewarned that discipleship is costly. It may cost us something, and we need to be willing to put Jesus first in everything. But look at verse 23. It says that when he got up and got into the boat, this is directly after that discord, he got on the boat, his disciples followed him. That's what disciples do, right? I mean, they follow Jesus. And so now they're following Jesus into the boat, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea. Now, the word used here for storm, the word that's translated storm in this context, is a word that's translated earthquake in chapter 27 and 28 of the same book. And so what we're looking at is not just a run-of-the-mill storm. This is a catastrophic storm. I mean, this is a huge storm. That's what Matthew is trying to emphasize here, is this is not an average storm. This is a big storm. And so that the boat was being covered with waves, but Jesus himself, he was asleep. Right? This big storm's coming, the biggest storm you've ever seen, and the waves are crashing down on your boat, and Jesus is sleeping. What does this remind you of? What other biblical story does this remind you of? Jonah, right? Doesn't this remind you of the story of Jonah? How Jonah was in Nineveh, or not in Nineveh, but was told to go to Nineveh, and instead of going to Nineveh to preach to the people, he does what? He flees, right? He runs away. He goes the other direction, and he gets in a boat, and he goes off to sea, and he's trying to run from or flee from the presence of God. And so we know that story. And so Jonah is fleeing, and of course, as he is doing so, as he is in the belly of this ship, and he is doing what? What is Jonah doing in the ship? He's sleeping. this big storm comes, right? God caused a huge storm to toss their boat around. Even these seasoned sailors, they're terrified of this storm, and they want to know what's going on, and they're trying to figure things out. And they go in, and the captain wakes up Jonah, who's still sleeping, by the way. And so they wake up Jonah, and they call him up, and they cast lots, and the lot falls on Jonah, and they realize that he's the problem. Sometimes the preacher's the problem. I just like to tell you that. But, he's the problem, right? Jonah's the problem. And so they start asking him a series of questions. What's happening to us? And who are you? And where did you come from? And who are your people? Remember, in Jonah chapter 1 and verse 9, he said to them, I'm a Hebrew. I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. How could you be sleeping at a time like this? How could you be sleeping in the belly of the ship while the ship is coming apart? How can you be sleeping? Why are you not afraid? And Jonah says, it's because I fear God. I fear God, the God of heaven, the one who made the sea, the one who made the dry land. If the Lord wants me to live, I'll live, right? That seems to be Jonah's mindset. If the Lord desires for me to live, I will live. Should I fear the sea? Should I fear the sea, or should I fear the God who created the sea? Which one? Which one's greater? Which one's bigger? Which one's more powerful? Which one has more authority over my life? And as we think about that, we go back to our illustration that we started off with, this idea that Jonah, or this illustration we started off with the snake. If I'm walking through the field and I'm going along and I don't realize, or maybe I do now, that there's a rattlesnake and I'm terrified, right? How petrified are you when you come across a snake? That's not fun, is it? You're not ready for it. It kind of surprises you, and all of a sudden you hear that little, and you're like, ah, and you're terrified. But then I look up, and guess what I see? I see a charging bull, and it's coming right at me. So what am I going to do? Who am I more afraid of? Am I more afraid of the charging bull, or am I more afraid of the snake? And I think that's the point, isn't it? That the idea is that what we fear is the thing that is most immediate in our life. That's what we fear. We fear the thing that is bigger and more important in our mind and most immediate in my life. And in the situation in the field, then that charging bull, that's more important right now, right? That's the immediate thing, because I got to get out of here, because, that snake may bite me, but that bull's going to, pound me into the ground. And we fear the thing that is bigger and greater in our mind. We fear the thing that is more immediate in our mind. What do we fear? To the sailors, it's the boat being in this turbulent water, isn't it? That's their greatest fear. To them, that's their most immediate thing. That's the thing that is right in front of them, is this big storm, and they're about to die. To Jonah, the greater thing in his mind, the immediate thing in his mind, is God. It's the God that made the sea. It's the God that made the land. That's the bigger thing in Jonah's mind. So the Bible uses this word fear in relation to God in two different ways. We either fear, we're terrified, we're afraid, finding ourselves in the wake of God's wrath, right? So that's a fearful thing, isn't it? To fall into the hands of the living God. We're fearful of that. When we find ourselves enemies of God, that should terrify us. That should make us afraid. Nineveh was in that situation once Jonah finally preached to them. Or it's used to show the greatness of God, isn't it? To say that God is the more powerful one. That God is the one who has more authority over all things. That in the mind and the eyes of man, God is the greater thing. God is the bigger thing. God is the more powerful. God has more authority. Therefore, we fear God. And for Jonah, it might have been a little of a bit of both, right? He's kind of in a weird situation. He's fleeing from God's presence. What do you expect when you flee from God's presence? You think God's going to pat you on the back and say, good job, Jonah? Way to go? No, of course not. He knows the consequences of fleeing from God, but he also knows his God, doesn't he? And he knows that God is bigger, and he knows that God is greater and more powerful and has more authority over his life than a storm. So he's in two. He's kind of broken into these two areas. But look back at Matthew chapter 8. The storm is raging on in our story, and Jesus is asleep, and his disciples come to him in verse 25, and they wake him up. You know, storyline really lines up with what we read in Jonah. And so they wake him up, and they're saying, "Save us, Lord. Save us. We are perishing." In verse 26, he said to them, Why are you afraid? Why are you afraid, you men of little faith? Now, we know that these men are fishermen. We know that they've been through a lot of storms, and I'm sure that they've seen a lot of stuff out at sea, but this must have been an incredible storm. I mean, this must have been a big one. This was terrifying. And Jesus wakes up and says to these sailors, "Why are you afraid? Why do you fear this? Why are you fearful, you men of little faith?" Now, this word faith, we have to understand, we always have to be reminded of the word, and the word faith in the Greek is pistis, and it means trust and commitment and belief. And that's the basic biblical definition of the word faith. And that's the idea, men of little faith, if they truly understood, right? If they understood who Jesus was with them in the boat, if they understood what Jesus was capable of doing, if they really grasped Jesus for who he truly was, if they really knew who was in the boat next to them, even though he was asleep, that doesn't matter, does it? Jesus is with them. In the storm on that day, they would have feared him more than they would have feared the storm. They would have feared him more than they would have feared the storm if they only had the faith to see Jesus as the greater thing. If they could only see Jesus as the bigger thing, the immediate thing in their life at that moment, they would have had courage to brave the storm with Jesus in the boat. If they could only see that, if they only had enough faith to see Jesus as the greater thing. So look at the rest of the verse. And then he got up. This whole story, I mean, I'd love to see this, in reality. I mean, the storm is raging. Jesus gets up. I'm sure he doesn't just pop back up. I mean, the boat's rocking, and he gets up, and then he rebukes the wind and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. Remember in the story of Jonah, the sailors had to throw Jonah overboard, right, to calm the storm. That's how they calmed the storm in Jonah's story. In this boat story, it's Jesus, right? He gets up, and he rebukes the storm. Who does that? I mean, who rebukes storms? I mean, who just gets up and says, "Stop," and it stops? And look at verse 27. It says, the men, they were amazed. Of course they were amazed. I mean, who wouldn't be amazed? What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Who has that kind of power? Who has that kind of authority that even the winds and the sea obey his voice? God does, right? God does. God has that kind of authority. Jesus has that kind of authority. The one who made the sea and the land is the one who has the authority to calm the raging storm. Jesus does. Why are you afraid, you men of little faith? Don't you know who I am? That's kind of the idea, isn't it? Don't you know who I am? Don't you know that I am the great I am? That I am Emmanuel, that I am God with you? Don't you know that I am the one who created all things? That I created all of this, like Paul says in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 and following. He says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were what? Created, right? All things were created. Both in the heavens and on the earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions, rulers and authorities, all things have been created through him, for him, and he is before all things. And in him all things hold together. When they got up, when these fishermen got up and left their nets behind, when they got up to follow Jesus, they weren't just following a Messiah. They weren't just following a prophet. They weren't just following a teacher. Now, Jesus is all of those things, of course, but he's more than that, isn't he? When they got up and they left their nets behind, they got up to follow God. They got up to follow God. the God of Jonah, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of the land and the sea. So the question is, who or what is greater? Is it the raging storm? Is that greater? Or is it Jesus? Is he the greater thing? Is he the greater thing? Why are you afraid, you men of little faith? And so, what about you? What about you? What about you? What are you afraid of? Well, what thing in life really terrifies you? I hope you've been kind of thinking about that and kind of questioning what it is. Well, when you wake up in the morning, what is the thing that's on your mind? What's the most immediate thing in your life? What's the greater thing in your life? What's the most important thing in your life? And how is it controlling you? You know, that's the thing about fear, is it controls us, doesn't it? It really does. It keeps us from doing what we're supposed to be doing. It keeps us in the boat, right? It keeps us at the shore. It keeps us next to our nets. It keeps us from following God. It keeps us away. Because fear motivates us in ways that are unhealthy in many ways. So ask yourself this question. Now that you've thought about it and you're thinking about it, what is the thing that terrifies you most? Just ask yourself this question. Every time it comes up, is God, is Jesus the greater thing in my life? Is Jesus the most immediate thing in my life? Is this fear telling me something about me? Is this fear communicating a message to me to say that maybe my focus is in the wrong place? Maybe I'm thinking about the wrong things. Maybe the immediate thing in my life is not the thing that should be the immediate thing in my life. See, I have no doubts. As I think back on this first century church and all the things that they endured and went through, I have no doubt that Christians in the first century when they were drug out of their homes, when they were put into prison, when they were tortured, when they were murdered and killed because of their allegiance to King Jesus, that there were times that they were afraid. Don't you think? I mean, think about it for a minute. Don't you think that there were times that they were terrified? I mean, who wouldn't be? Who wouldn't be with a Roman soldier beating down your door with swords and they're here to drag you away or to just kill you on the spot? Who wouldn't be terrified of a situation like that? It's terrifying. Who wouldn't be afraid? But disciples of Jesus, they're not fearless, are they? We're not fearless. We have fears. We have terrors. We have things that bother us. There are things that scare us. There are things that make us uncomfortable. But disciples of Jesus, they do fear less. We fear less. We fear less in light of Jesus' power. We fear less in light of Jesus' authority. We fear less in light of Jesus' presence. You see, when Jesus is the greater, the immediate thing in our life, we fear less. And we need to have enough faith. We need to have enough trust. We need to have enough commitment and belief in Jesus that he is the greater thing, right? That he becomes the greater thing. We need to be disciples that follow Jesus even to the death. We need to be disciples that are willing to leave everything behind and follow Jesus, knowing very well that it's going to cost us something. We need to be disciples that make Jesus the greater thing. And we wake up in the morning, we think about him. We go to bed at night, we think about him. When we live our life, he is the greater thing. And when he's the greater thing, disciples will fear less of the things of this world. Because Jesus is greater, isn't he? I mean, isn't he greater than everything and anything that we can possibly encounter in this life? Isn't he greater? Isn't he bigger than even death itself? That even if this life leads to death, that we will live? Isn't that what Brother John told us in our prayer this morning? That the resurrection is coming? Don't you believe that? Dost thou believe? Jesus is the greater thing. He has power and authority over all things. He is able to save us in the midst of tremendous difficulties. So we fear the Lord, right? We fear the Lord God of heaven, the one who made the sea and the dry land, because disciples of Jesus fear less in light of his presence. So if there's anybody here this morning who needs to put on Jesus in baptism and become part of this community of believers. If there's anybody here this morning who needs prayers from the congregation that we can encourage you and strengthen you in any way, please come forward and the elders will minister to you as we stand and as we sing.